Hello, everyone. My name is John McKay, and I'm the Member of Parliament for Scarborough-Guildwood. And joining me today is Brian Stiller, a longtime friend. I won't call you an old friend, Brian, because that's not a good thing to call you. But a longtime friend who has had an amazing career in and around the evangelical churches and movements. He's been a professor. He's been a president of a university. He helped create a university. And lately, he's been an ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance. So I've asked Brian to join me today just to talk about the role of religion in the 21st society. And what we're going to do is move from a domestic conversation to a larger international conversation. So let me start off with this question, Brian. And the question is, if I said the word evangelical on the streets of Toronto, I would get a lot of very mixed views, some of them quite negative. What would your response be, particularly to those who see evangelicals as a negative role in larger Canadian society?
Well, that's changed in the last few years, of course, because we are overwhelmed by American ideas, information, and voices. And because a particular American phenomenon in religion, which has globally, in some ways, influenced the definition of evangelical, it has impacted public perception. To answer your specific question, the word evangelical not only has historic meaning, but it's biblical meaning. And so the word evangelical is a helpful word. It's a descriptive word of people who believe particular things as Christians. But it's become politicized, especially through the religious right, which rose in the US with a guy by the name of Jerry Falwell in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected. And you have a very peculiar kind of mosaic in the US where the southern US, which was very fundamentalist Protestant, very much in both the racist and the Jim Crow era, had a particular kind of intense commitment towards their biblical faith related to their view of their society. And their view of society is what you call manifest destiny, which was a belief. Americans had a belief that God had particularly chosen the US as a place where he would manifest his goodness in the destiny of Americans. And so Americans, many of them, coalesced their biblical faith in Jesus Christ with a cultural, political aspiration. And if you at some point began to deny that inclusion of politics within that more fundamentalist view of life, it created a reaction. And so in the 60s and 70s in the US, you have this encroaching liberalism, which seemed to push evangelicals or the conservatives away from public life and a redefining of American life. And this created an enormous reaction, which eventually resulted in the moral majority, Ronald Reagan, and the rise of the religious right. And so to come to your specific question, and so over the last 4 to 5 years, with Donald Trump coming to the fore, he was latched onto by this religious right in the US, which are called evangelical, which is an appropriate term for them. But they moved to an extreme political position, and they latched on to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump latched on to them to define politics in a particular religious way. And so, as a result, the word evangelical was polarized by a radical religious right in the US. Some places in Canada, but very modest in size, but it has influenced people to think of evangelicals in a particular way, and that particular way is a religious right under the U.S. Sorry for a long answer to a very
No,
important
but
question.
but it's actually a helpful answer, and I largely agree with your analysis. And Canadian evangelicals, I think, have been negatively impacted by the spillover from some of the craziness that goes on in the U.S. Evangelical movement. But I know you've written about the history of evangelicals in Canada, and it's a kind of an interesting history of embracing the larger society and then pulling away from the larger society. So, if you could share with us the thoughts, if you will, the last 100 years of evangelicals and how they've integrated or not into a larger Canadian society.
Well, John, if we could go back to 1900, at that point, you basically have a country, Catholic in primarily Quebec, and the rest of the country was primarily Protestant. So you have Catholic and Protestant, that's the division. In the early part of the 20th century, you have within the Protestant church, you have a division. And it resulted by the mid to late century, it resulted in the mainline Protestant churches. You have the Congregational, Presbyterian, and Methodist combined in the United Church in 1925. And you have those churches and the United Church, and then the result and the ongoing Presbyterian church that continued. You have that church moving to what we call into a theological liberalism, questioning of the authority of the scripture, eventually even wondering about the divinity of Christ. You have that liberal shift going on in the early to the mid part of the 20th century, and with that shift to the left, you have a corresponding shift to the right. And that conservative community, which we now call evangelical, eventually made up about 8 to 9% of the Canadian population. But that community, of which I am a part, Pentecostals, Christian Missionary Alliance, Methodists, or Mennonites, most Mennonites, Baptists, those churches, the leadership felt that for them to continue on with their biblical mandate, they needed to move away from what the liberal Protestant church was doing. And part of what the liberal Protestant church was doing was engaging in public life. And so the conservative, or the growing evangelical community, said, we'll deal with the primary issues of getting people converted and ready for heaven. And we'll leave the public issues, public policy, leadership, and so forth, we'll leave it to the mainline Protestant churches. And so we abdicated the salt and light metaphor, which Jesus used powerfully, and we removed ourselves from society. We thinking that society would be run by the mainline Protestants and Catholics on the basis of our biblical vision of life. But we found in the 70s and 80s that wasn't true. The society was going in directions that we felt were inappropriate. And it's at that point that the evangelical community reinserted itself into the social public life. And so in 1984, when Mulroney is elected, you have a whole number of elected members of parliament who are evangelical, most of them conservative at the time. They engaged with Mulroney, and a number of them became some of his senior cabinet ministers. And so you have at that point a complete readjustment of evangelical thought about what is the role of our community, Bible believers, if you like, what is our role within the public sectors of life, education, government, whatever. And we recognized we had made a mistake in the early and mid part of the 20th century, and we tried to adjust and correct. Sometimes we overcorrected, sometimes undercorrected, but again, it was a movement towards realizing that, to use a biblical phrase, the earth is the Lord's, the fullness thereof, and all they that dwell therein. As a famous Reformed a theologian and politician out of Holland said, there's not one square inch of creation that God doesn't say, that's mine. And so as Christians, we recognize that we had a responsibility. And so issues of justice, for example, while we were always concerned about justice understand the systemic issues. And we realize that if God says, I love justice, that we should love justice too. And that created a different platform on which our re-engagement in the public life was facilitated.
And you were personally involved in that as you founded the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, and were a serious advocate both in Ottawa and elsewhere, and which leads me and that group continues on as we speak, and certainly there are elements in that where I actually phone them up and ask them, what is it I think, because they've actually done some thinking about various issues. So I find EFC actually quite helpful. But I wanted to talk as well about the larger role of religion in Canadian society. So I represent a riding that is about as multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic as any riding in the entire country. And a lot of the rhythms of the life of my constituents are governed by their religion. For instance, we're at the end of Ramadan. And I think it's tonight that is the big celebration of the end of the fast. Yeah, exactly. Yet there is an element in, say, Quebec society, the most, if you will, anti-religious of all of the societies in Canada, that basically wants to drum religion out of the public square. And I'd be interested in your reflections on not only, as Wayne Gretzky would say, where the puck is, but where the puck is going. And get your reflections on that tension between what's in French terms called laïcité and the current manifestations, not only of evangelicalism, but also Islam and Judaism and Hindus, et cetera, all of which are practiced quite vigorously in my society.
Well, the Quebec situation is very peculiar. Let me come back to that in a moment. But the kind of the macro has been the secularization of our society, and in a sense, I applaud that. In that, I want a government. I want a society that is a secular liberal democracy. Secular in the sense that it has no predisposition towards any religion. It is liberal in the European sense of the autonomous individual, the right of individuals to make a choice of their political overlords, and democratic. So we applaud a secular, liberal, democratic society for all those reasons. The problem with secularization is that while it initially was, if I can use this preposition, it was freedom of religion. In other words, no one was coerced by any means, and least of all government, to have any one particular religion or no religion at all. It was a smorgasbord table. You make your choice, and you have every right. As a liberal democracy, the autonomy of the individual, you have every right to make your choice as to what religion you serve. So it was freedom of religion. But what secularization has come to mean increasingly is freedom from religion. And so while we said, whatever your religious belief is, you have opportunity to make those choices, and we accept you as an integral part of our society, and you can rise to any level of leadership or vocation in this society, and your religion or non-religion has no impact on that at all. Freedom of religion. But now we have moved to the place where where secularization has come to mean freedom from religion. So we've changed the preposition of, from of to from. So the impact is, for example, if you're going to apply to be a professor at a university, and you show that you are evangelical, it's almost to the place now where having religion of any kind disallows you. So that's the macro. Now in Quebec, that's the most astounding thing to use. It seems to me, as a layperson, as I just watch it from the sidelines, that there is at the base of it a racial attitude that wants to marginalize people of other cultures. And the way to do it is to prohibit the use of religious symbols. Now, John, I may have it completely wrong, but the violation of the autonomy of the individual and the secularization that we have espoused is shocking. And I'm completely befuddled as to why the senior leadership of our federal government is not speaking to that issue, because that is so foundational to our national democracy, that for a province to imbibe in that kind of hemlock juice is, to me, a shock.
And I share that view. I think the cheap and cheerful explanation is that this is pure politics, that no particular federal party wants to take on an antagonistic role to the province of Quebec, the
Yes.
government of the province of Quebec, for fear of being further shut out of the seats. And I don't think it's that much more complicated. It does astound me that you're not able to be, let alone not a professor in any university, but not any civil servant, if you're wearing a kippah, or if you're a Sikh and you're wearing a beard, or a priest wearing a collar backwards, or any of the other religious symbols that we just simply, certainly in Ontario for the time being at least, take for granted.
Yes.
And I think that ultimately Quebec marginalizes itself by that attitude, and where it all ends up, I don't really know, but I think there will be a flat out rebellion against this forced marginalization.
Well, now that we've covered that one.
Okay, well, then we'll move on to the international scene. Yeah, I think, Brian, we're in radical agreement here. This is terrible. I think I might be have been too influenced by your books, but Brian, let me actually shift gears here and move to the international scene. And you have been an acute observer of the international religious scene writ large, but in particular, as the ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance, you have literally traveled the globe to see the phenomenal growth of evangelicalism around the world, to the point, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, where it's anticipated that the growth of evangelicalism will overtake the number of Hindus in the world by 2040. So give me an idea of what you are observing, because what you are observing around the world is a huge contrast to what the government of Quebec, and more accurately the Society of Quebec, is trying to suppress.
Yeah. John, let me just back up just for 1 second and define evangelical. Evangelical Christians are people who are Protestants. So if you look at the world, you have Christians, you have Catholics and Protestants. We're within the Protestant community. Now, when you look at the overall global Christian community, there are 2.4 billion Christians. Half of those are Roman Catholics, so 1.2 billion are Christians. About 500 million are within what's called the World Council of Churches, which includes 300 million Orthodox. And then there's about 650 million evangelicals. So of the Christians today, evangelicals make up about a quarter of the pie. So about 25% of the world's Christians are evangelicals. We are people who believe the Bible is true. We believe that Jesus is the only way of salvation. We believe in making known the gospel and caring for neighbors. So that's kind of a four-pillar superstructure summary of evangelicals. In 1960, interesting enough, in 1960, around the world, there were 90 million evangelicals. Today, there are 650 million. So in those 60 years, we've gone from being 90 million to 650 million. For example, in Latin America, in 1900, there were 50,000 evangelicals. Today, there's 100 million in just Latin America. So this is a world phenomenon. The Protestant world has changed. It's happened because you have the evangelical community, its message and its methodology has spread around the world. Some places it's majority faith, other places it's a very vibrant, even though a minority faith. So that's the kind of the global picture. The evangelical community worldwide then has an influence and an opportunity to serve in ways that often we in Quebec, or in Canada or Quebec, Quebec and Canada, whereas sometimes we fail to see that larger picture, and that the secularizing process in Canada is so antithetical to what's generally going on worldwide. And that speaks to the point that you made.
Yeah. Well, Canada seems to be going in one direction. Well, maybe Western countries seem to be going in one direction, and the rest of the world seems to be going in another. Now, the growth even in evangelicalism is largely Central, South America, Africa. Where else have you observed it to be growing?
Well, the global South, includes Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So you have just on the Christian side, you had 700,000 Christians in China in 1949 when Mao took over, and today you have anywhere from 120 to 140 million in China. So the growth of the Christian message is quite astounding, and sometimes it results in conflict. But I have found increasingly that there is a real interest among evangelicals to find common basis for interaction and understanding and help for each other. So, for example, 2 years ago in Sri Lanka, after the Easter bombings, the Buddhist majority government began to assault the Muslim minority community, because the persons who did the bombings, they were from a Muslim family, but it was a Muslim family influenced by ISIS, and not reflective of the Muslim community within Sri Lanka. And so the evangelical community, which is a small but a very strong and dynamic force in Sri Lanka, it went to bat for the Muslim community and stood with them physically in front of government troops to try and protect the Muslim world. So we're finding in many places, while you do have conflict with Islam in places like Pakistan and northern Nigeria, generally there is a growing respect for each other and an attempt to find ways in which we can ameliorate the violence and build common affirmation and understanding, again, for the right and the respect of people to make their own religious choices.
There is a white-hot anger towards the government of China right now, as China asserts itself on the world stage and tries to turn the rest of the nations into vassal states. The Chinese Christian church divides kind of into two groups, ones that seem to be able to get along with the government of China, and the other which seems to irritate the government of China. I'd be interested in your observations with respect to the role of Christians in China, and how they might be one of these reconciling agents to world conflict.
Oh, yeah, it's very, very complex. Within our evangelical community, we have what they call the house churches and the registered churches, or registered and unregistered churches. Of the 140 or 120, whatever the number is, million Christians in China, about 75% of those would be what they call registered or unregistered churches. And so you have an attempt by the government under its China Christian Council. It attempts to try and register churches, and by doing, they have the possibility. Not always do they exercise it, but they have the possibility of influencing in a significant way what the churches will do. So you do have deep division within the community over their fear and their antipathy towards government, and thus the reluctance to register. We find it as a world body, the World Evangelical Alliance. We are walking that very fine line, because we do have relationship with the government. We do not have an alliance in China, but we have met regularly. I've met on a number of occasions in the Forbidden City with the most senior people in the government on matters of faith. But I've also spent many weeks with the unregistered church, traveling around China and realizing that at any moment they can be shut down. In fact, yesterday I just had popped up a picture on Facebook, a church I was at in Beijing 3 years ago with their 15 staff. There was a picture of us they'd taken together, and last year it was shut down. The largest church in Beijing was shut down, and its pastor thrown in prison. So you do have a very mixed dynamic. But the issue in China is not the government's feelings towards people of faith, because in a sense, it doesn't matter to them what you believe. Their biggest concern is grouping, is congregations, is public assemblies, because they realize that a grassroots organization grows by assembly, by people who come together. And so when they want to keep the groups to small amounts, they want to be able to control them, because that is their fear that at some point you can have a political takeover, even indeed as the Kuomintang fell under Mao, because he did that very thing. And so their big concern, as I find it, is over your groupings, how large your assemblies are, and they want to keep control of that. But internally, the fear is that there is a new cult being developed under President Xi, and that cult is so influential as to create a bias towards communistic materialism over kind of a spiritual, mystical faith.
Mm. Yeah, I can't disagree with you. It is extraordinarily complex, but it does actually have significant implications for how we as a nation conduct our foreign affairs.
Yes.
And it's kind of difficult to see how we can be agents of salt and light in a situation such as that. Let me
Yes,
just
John, on that, I have great respect for the difficulties of a federal government to manage that portfolio. That's got to be the most difficult one in the world, because of the economic, social, religious, human rights factors that all blend together, and because of the enormous influence of this country and its growing influence. As a small country like Canada, to manage it's difficult. At the same time, we do realize that history will account to history for how we handle those that are being so destructively abused in the western part of China. And so what we say and do today, as we know it, really matters.
Yeah, I agree with that, and in the sense that the abuse of the Uyghurs is, some would say the genocide of the Uyghurs is reflective of the possibility that other entities, other religious entities in particular, their rights are also being abused, and so the religious rights for one are as important as the religious rights for others. And I sometimes think that what our secular society misses is that because it doesn't value religious rights, that it actually misses the point. It would rather describe the rights that are being abused as ethnic rights or or political rights. They don't particularly appreciate that religious rights, and I'll be interested in your thoughts on this, are actually the right of religion and belief is the foundational right of all other rights. And let me end with that simple question and see get your response to it.
Well, religious rights are not just about choosing a religion. Religious rights are about thinking and believing in the inner part of my own being, what I believe to be true, what I believe to be best. And that right gives me as an individual that autonomy to make those choices. Now, where did this come from? Well, I think it came from a biblical understanding of creation, that we are made in the image of God, and that image is of a person, of a being having not only the ability but the consequent rights to make choices about what I will ultimately think, believe, and follow. So religious liberty is not just about choosing a religion. And so you got the smorgasbord of religions, which one will you choose? No, it's about the person having that dignity and kind of global and eternal presence within self to make choices about what matters to me, what I believe ultimately to be true. And so religious liberty, it actually is a term and a denotation that gives respect to myself as an individual. And that to me is a very biblical vision. And I think one could make a case historically that the Western world, at least, of which we are a part, we emerged out of that biblical theological vision that gave rights to individuals.
Well, that is probably a perfect spot to close off this interview, because it is the autonomy of the individual in relationship to God is in fact the foundation in that analysis of all of our other rights and beliefs. And because of that, we can talk about having the right to this and the right to that. Brian, you have been, as usual, supremely articulate. I think your perspective is one that needs to be heard more broadly. And so hopefully this podcast will be helpful in doing that. I take your view that that maybe Canadian society needs to be much more respectful of the religious expressions in the individual constituent members of society. So thank you, Brian, for doing this. We appreciate your time, and we'll end there.
Well, John, thank you for the opportunity of being with you again. And thank you for your years of service and national leadership. You have been articulate. You've stood out. You've shared your opinions with courage, and we just respect you and are grateful for you. So thank you.
But the sharing of my opinions has not always been well received, shall we say?
Well, that's true for us all, I think.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it.